Hey guys, thanks so much for taking the time to join us in our study of Galatians. We're so grateful that you chose to use your time wisely to be a part of what God is doing here, and thanks for being part of one of our groups. We're really excited about all that God is doing through Vaughn Forest, so thank you guys so much. And we're going to be beginning our new series in Galatians, and our first session today is going to be focusing on part of chapter 1. And the really interesting thing about the book of Galatians is that Paul is writing addressing some theological heresy, some people who are trying to confuse other people to buy into rules that Jesus never called His people to follow. So you have the Old Testament, and the Old Testament had the Old Testament law. And Jews were called by God to follow those laws. That was God's law, and they were made right with God based on keeping these laws with perfection. Well, as you read through the Old Testament, it becomes very obvious and clear that no one can keep the Old Testament laws. Every person falls short. That's why Romans 3:23 says, "For all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory." And so there was a group of people after Jesus came and fully kept the law on our behalf and made us right with God the Father through our personal faith in Christ alone. There was a group of religious people who were so heavily influenced by the Jewish law because they were Jewish that they began to go after Gentile Christians and others and enforce this law back on them, pretty much telling them that their faith in Jesus was not enough, that Christ alone was not enough, that you need to follow these laws so that you can be in right standing with God. And so there began to be a lot of confusion. And so the book of Galatians is a letter written to that church addressing these types of issues. Now, these letters that Paul would write, that we now refer to as books in the New Testament, they would circulate through the churches in those regions to teach them about what was appropriate and what was not right. And the book of Galatians is specifically written to address this. And so I'm going to kind of jump in, and I'm just going to share a little bit, and then in your group you're going to discuss and you're going to read through and talk more in depth about this. But check out what Galatians chapter 1, verse 6 says. Now, this is Paul addressing the confusion of these religious leaders, these what's known as Judaizers. They're trying to reinforce the law back on these Christians. Here's what Paul says. He says in verse 6, he says, "I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ." And check this out, "and are turning to a different gospel." Check this out, verse 7, "which is really no gospel at all." Wow. Such powerful words that Paul says, man, you guys once were pursuing Jesus. You embraced the gift of salvation that can only be bought through the perfect life and blood and sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And now you are beginning to believe in a second gospel, which is really no gospel at all. It's actually a confusion of the true gospel. It is what we would refer to as a cult. These people were trying to infiltrate their Christian community with false teaching and ultimately lead them to become a cult, a group that was worshiping falsely to bring confusion. This is a great way the enemy does this. And Paul addresses this with these people and he says, listen, you need to remember who you are in Jesus. This is not a gospel at all. You've turned away so quickly, you've been swayed. And so he's kind of slapping them on the hand and reprimanding them to be reminded of what God has done and to turn back to the truth that they know. And so what you guys are going to be doing in your group right now is you're going to study a little bit of the history, and then you're going to go through some different questions. You're going to have a lot of fun. It's going to be an awesome time as you look at the first chapter, or at least verse 1 through 9 of Galatians. So, man, thank you so much for being part of this group. I hope you guys have a great time.